Hi, this is our presentation over superheroes in previous generations compared to superheroes in Generation Z, which is our generation. Our argument question is how have superheroes in previous generations compared to superheroes in our generation?
Okay, so first we're going to talk about the silent generation and superheroes. Now, superheroes during this time largely reflected the events that were going on at the time. Take the Great Depression, for example. During the Great Depression, we saw a huge amount of economic turmoil and political corruption. Now, creators that were creating at this time made superheroes like Superman, who was fighting this very corruption that they were living in. Soon after, we saw World War II. And in World War II, we saw a new wave of superheroes, and this included Captain America, who was very influential at the time. He could be seen on the front of comics punching Hitler himself. Now, this means he was really a tool of success for the US government, because his comics may have shaped his readers more than he was shaped by society. Because readers were essentially reading propaganda of the US government, because it expressed the motives and beliefs of the US. Now, contrary to this, we have Germany, and in Germany, they withheld these comics due to their anti-Nazi content. Now, we're going to move on to the real-world problems in Generation X.
So, one of the most prevalent political topics during the time of Generation X, which is 1961 to 1981, was the Cold War, towards the beginning of Generation X. But this very profoundly impacted much of the superheroes created during Generation X. So the American peoples during the Cold War, throughout the entire Cold War, had a very anti-communist point of view. So there's a lot of derogatory terms that can be found from comic books issued during this time period, such as dirty reds, dirty commies, things like that. And because superheroes were targeted towards younger audience, because younger audiences were the primary consumers of superheroes at the time, they were actually really impacted by the anti-communist dialogue that was inputted into the superheroes at the time.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about millennials and superheroes. So millennials are also known as Generation Y. It's from 1980s to early 2000s. So really, superheroes had a lot of influence on Generation Y. They really raised political awareness by having political figures being featured in their comics. An example is Barack Obama after the 2008 presidential election. He really appeared in many comics, one as Spidey Meets the President, which is seen over here. It was really popular and it advocated his position in office. And this has happened with many presidents too. Generation Y also had an influence on superheroes itself. They really aided in the spread of diversification to society. There were really many racially diverse and female superheroes such as Storm over there. They were introduced and it really affected society in many ways. After witnessing these different superheroes, Generation Y really wanted more representation shown, so they demanded more basically, which spawned many diverse and different superheroes.
Okay, so superheroes in Generation Z. So superheroes in Generation Z primarily influence social issues such as women's empowerment and LGBTQ representation. Generation Z also influenced the development of superheroes by making them have higher gender, LGBTQ, and religious diversification. An example of this would be Kamala Khan. She's the new Miss Marvel. She is Muslim, a Muslim American Pakistani teenager who has shape-shifting abilities. Another example would be America Chavez. She is Miss America. She is queer and she has lesbian mothers. This is Kamala Khan, and that is Miss America. Even though Wonder Woman came out several decades ago, in her new movie that came out in June 2017, she was revealed as bisexual.
Okay, so over 70 years separate these two generations, yet we're still able to find some similarities between them. For example, we see with the silent generation, troops that read these comics were really, it boosted their morale and provided them with a sense of patriotism. And for Generation Z, we saw the inspirement of the LGBTQ community, and this was largely due to the public recognition of superheroes that embodied those qualities. Now, along with these similarities come some differences, and of those were that Generation Z was able to inspire such a large range of people beyond the LGBTQ community by diversifying its superheroes. And this contrasts greatly to the silent generation because there we see superheroes who were mostly white males.
So there are many similarities between Generation X's superheroes and Generation Z's superheroes, but one of the most prevalent similarities is that both Generation X and Generation Z, authors of superheroes, intended to install what they view as a sense of patriotism. So for Generation X, that would be anti-communism, or the idea of having an anti-communist world. And for Generation Z, it would be having equal rights for everyone, or equal representation for everyone. Some of the most prevalent differences, however, are that Generation X's superheroes are very politically oriented, whereas Generation Z superheroes nowadays are very purely socially oriented, with things like race, gender, sexual orientation, things like that, that aren't as political as they were before.
So given the time period, millennials and Generation Z really have a lot in common. There are many similarities. Generation Y was really the very first step for diversification in society, while Generation Z managed to really intensify it, basically. And they're also both very outspoken on controversial issues, but as always, there's always some differences. While Generation Y was barely learning about how to embrace these differences among people, Generation Z's youth has really been taught early on to embrace these differences. And during the early Generation Y, it was seen as slightly controversial with all these diversities. But now Generation Z is really pushing these boundaries, and it's honestly more controversial than ever.
So in conclusion, and also the solution to the question that we posed at the beginning of this presentation, which was how does Generation Z superheroes compare to previous generation superheroes, we can see that with a diversified society, diverse byproducts are inevitable. So in this case, that would be superheroes. The more diverse our society becomes, the more diverse the superheroes that we produce become. Also, our society now focuses a lot on very socially oriented things. So, like sexual orientation, LGBTQ rights, race, religion, diversification of that stuff, whereas back then it was very politically embroiled time period.